I'm Ken Moss, the Harriet Olaf Professor of Modern Jewish History and the site director of the Joyce and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. It's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce a wonderful scholar and an old friend. Dr. Olga Borovaya is an independent scholar who's taught Sephardic history and Ladino literature at Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and other American universities. She's the author of 3 highly regarded books, pivotal books, in Sephardic history and Ladino studies: Modern Ladino Culture, Press, Belles Lettres, and Theater in the Late Ottoman Empire in 2011, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. The Beginnings of Ladino Literature, Moses Almos Niño and His Readers, 2017. And most recently, just within the last few months, the 1840 Rhodes Blood Libel, Ottoman Jews at the Dawn of the Tanzimat Era. And today, Olga will be revisiting, I guess you could say, a first love, which is the history of Ladino literature itself.
It's still my love, I feel it.
Still first always. Ladino Judeo-Spanish literature of the Sephardic Jews, a new history. Olga.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Ken for inviting me and for his generous introduction. I also want to thank Nancy and Mike, who made it all possible, especially when we decided to reschedule this talk. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And I'm a little anxious about those who asked us to reschedule the talk because they expected it to be very good. Well, I hope you will not be disappointed because there's no other lecture on Ladino literature. So either this or nothing. And immediately, okay, and disclaimer, I'm going to present you my view of Ladino literature. It's neither correct or incorrect. It's mine. And I will be happy if someone else or when someone else comes and offer something different. That will start a new conversation. For now, that's the only systematic study. So what's Ladino literature? It is a corpus of text created between mid-16th and mid-20th centuries by Sephardic Jews, the descendants of the Jews that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula and settled in the Ottoman Empire. So it's that language, sorry. Ladino is an Ibero-Romance language which emerged in the 16th century in the Ottoman Empire and was used in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans through World War II. For most of its history, it used a Hebrew script, which is called Rashi, after about the Rabbi Rashi. I don't know why it's called so. Now, the most important factor in the history of Ladino literature is diglossia, which is use of 2 or more languages within the same speech community for different social functions. To give a quick, clear example, someone speaks Chinese at home, but when this person goes to the university, he or she has to speak English. So that's an example of diglossia, except it's not communal. So this diglossia, yes, we usually talk about the high language, H, and the low language, L. The high language is associated with law, religion, education, and an authoritative corpus of text, in our case, the Bible. Nobody uses it in conversation. The L language, in our case, Ladino, the vernacular, or Laaz, that is a non-Hebrew language, is used at home and at work. Because the superposed language is always learned in formal settings, those who do not have access to education obviously do not learn it. And that means almost all women, Sephardi women, and many men. Now you can already guess that the Ladino literature emerged because there were many people who did not know Hebrew, and someone needed to tell them something. Ladino literature has not been studied for two reasons. Maybe it's all one reason. Well, first of all, because of its low aesthetic value. Well, that's of course not a scholarly approach. And it's true that Ladino literature did not produce works of lasting value. But for scholars of minority literatures, it's interesting because it shows how particular historic events create new audiences and even prompt the appearance of a particular literary form. And then centuries later, another historic event causes its demise. The first, the consideration that Ladino literature is not valuable, that's of course a very old-fashioned approach. Now, people who study Ladino literature, that is describing, and mainly in Spain, they start the history of Ladino literature in the 18th century. They do not recognize as Ladino literature what was written in the 16th century, though Sephardim themselves always did. They start in the 18th century with the religious, with popular Bible commentary, and consider the Bible the golden age of Ladino literature, with which I disagree. And then they talk about decline in the 19th century due to the pernicious influence of European culture. They think that only in the 18th century did Ladino, quote unquote, reach its final shape. Languages never reach a final shape, such a thing doesn't exist. Their live languages continue developing every day. Sorry. Now, because I already mentioned that we're interested in events, for the study of Ladino literature, I adopt a historical approach. And we'll study, discuss it in chronological order. Now I'm going to tell you about my periodization, then go period by period, and to the very sad end. So because I believe that that Ladino literature emerged in the 16th century. Because Ladino literature is didactic par excellence, it's very helpful to present it as a series of educational projects. The first project had to deal with the consequences of mass conversions. I will tell you about it later. It was necessary to educate those people. And this was not a big group, and the corpus of text created at that time is the smallest. The second period started in the wake of the Sabbatean movement. And it was the rabbi's response to the spiritual, to low education of, or ignorance rather, of the masses. They considered that Jews were nominal Jews and they needed to become real Jews, and but they did not know Hebrew, and many didn't even read Ladino. So that is a big project which started in the 18th century and continued through the 19th, but its heyday was the 18th. Finally, the third project starts in 1845 with the publication of first Ladino periodical. And the credo of this period is European-style education as a universal remedy. This period creates the largest corpus of text, religious and secular, different genres, and I consider this the golden age of Ladino literature. Now let's go to back to the 16th century. So when the Jews, Iberian Jews, there was no Spain, of course, were expelled from Spain, from Castile and Aragon in 1492, many of them, some went to the Ottoman Empire, but many moved to Portugal. But in Portugal, 5 years later, they had the same choice. Again, some people left, others remained as Jews, as Christians, sorry. And there were mass conversions, which were very traumatic for the people who were baptized by force. those who continued, who chose to be Christians, they lived in Portugal quite safely until 1536, when the Inquisition tribunal was established in Portugal. As Christians, they were in Inquisition's jurisdiction. That's why, again, many went to the Ottoman Empire, but many went to Europe because they already had lived as Christians. In Europe, they continued living as Christians. But the situation changed. And first of all, the establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal made those who already lived in Europe go to the Ottoman Empire, and the others moved later when the Papal States made it impossible for these Christians, new Christians, to live there. So all of them came to the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the century, 16th century. But these people who had lived as Christians did not know anything or very little about Judaism, and they had to be re-educated immediately. They had to be taught normative Judaism, yet they did not know Hebrew. So the solution was to teach them the Hebrew alphabet and then produce text in Ladino, because Ladino, first of all, it uses vowels, and also it's as a Romance language, was close to their dialect, Romance dialect, and that really solved the problem. But to teach them, many new books had to be printed. First of all, the Constantinople Bible in 1547, then the Prophets, then a Musar, ethical treatise, Hebrew Ladino dictionaries, Shulchan Aruch in the Ladino version, a bridge version of Shulchan Aruch, the women's Siddur, prayer book, and yes, but these people were actually, most of them were well off, and they were educated. Many of them had gone to universities, so they were interested in the history of the Ottoman Empire, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy, but they could not read Hebrew. And so here comes Rabbi Moses Al-Musnino, who was dedicated to the integration of converso Jews, ex-converts, to Judaism. He lived in Salonika, where his congregation consisted of Portuguese ex-conversos. Some were among his relatives and his friends and patrons at the court. He wrote at least 7 works. Only 5 are extant. Among them, 2 important books. One was published in Salonika in 1564, the Regimen of Living. That's a paraphrase for Jewish use of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And it was published in Holland in the 18th century in Latin script. The other book was never published in the Ottoman Empire. We know it as Chronicle of Ottoman Kings, and it includes 2 chronicles of the sultans. The aim of this book was to introduce those newcomers to the Ottoman Empire, to the political system, and persuade them to collaborate with this government. This book was published in Latin script in the 17th century in Spain. Of course, it had to be adapted for Christians and abridged. So he's the only author, Al-Muslim is the only author known outside the Ottoman Empire. The process of education went very well, apparently, and the immigration essentially came to a standstill by the end of the 16th century. And there were no more educated Jews who did not know Hebrew. That's an oxymoron, of course. But for a short period, educated people did not know Hebrew. So we have a certain corpus of secular Ladino literature. But because Mesnino had to write to them in Ladino, he apologized at the start of every work, saying that he wouldn't use Ladino, of course, the vernacular, but it's done for educational reasons. And he talked about serious matters. And so the language of these works is what I call high register, the high register of Ladino. So by the end of the 16th century, the audience disappeared. Everybody already knew Hebrew. As far as but in the 16th century, not only Ladino literature, but also Ladino printing emerged because books were printed for the wealthy who could afford them, for the educated. So of course, they would not, otherwise they wouldn't probably publish anything in Ladino. The rabbis had dealt with the traumas of mass conversion and expulsion, but in 1665, another crisis struck the community. That year, a young Jew from Izmir, Shabbatai Tzvi, proclaimed himself the Messiah. And he was followed by tens of thousands of people, rich, poor, rabbis. Actually, most rabbis turned to his side. And he changed all the rules. His birthday, presumably, was on Tisha B'Av. And there was such excitement, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but in the Jewish communities of Europe. Europeans came to the Ottoman Empire. And there was excitement. So trade stopped in Izmir, normal life stopped. And there was so much excitement that the authorities didn't like it. And so in February 1966, Shabtai Tzvi was arrested on government's orders, and he converted to Islam under duress. Hundreds of people followed him. This event it was a momentous event that had long-lasting consequences. The rabbis returned to normative Judaism. And they decided that the best way of dealing with this, of forgetting Shabtai Tzvi, was not mentioning him. So he was never mentioned until the middle of the 19th century. But it certainly did not lose its way. Matthias Lermat suggested that the rabbis, he called them vernacular rabbis, the rabbis who in the 18th century started writing in vernacular, that they did not have to deal with the heresy, quote unquote, itself. There was no threat, but they had to deal with the spiritual consequences of this event. And that, of course, was the main reason. But there is another cause, which nobody, for some reason, has ever mentioned. It's a perceptible influence of European literature. Every document written by the rabbis at that time starts by condemnations of European literature, of novels, but nobody ever paid attention to that. So this project was initiated by a team of 3 people. The first was John Ashkenazi, who was a printer from Galicia. He established his printing press in Istanbul in 1710. Then he was joined by 2 other people. So Abraham Assa, who was actually the latest addition to this group, was an amazing translator. He translated probably 50 books. And John Ashkenazi published most of them. Actually, he published 125 books. Assa translated everything. Musars, and he translated the Bible. And his translation of the Bible, of the Pentateuch, was actually almost the same as what we have in the 16th century. That is a so-called Cog style. It's a translation that follows the Cog's morphological, lexical, syntactic Cogs, and even they try to choose a word that sounds phonetically similar to the Hebrew word. It's very hard to read. Unless one knows Hebrew, the strange word order, the sentences without the copula verb, it's very hard to read. So people really didn't read it. But then Assad translated the prophets, and for the first time, he printed it in Russian script, which people could read easily. And finally, so he started in 39 and he ended in 1843. So the five scrolls were written in a very entertaining style. And this is why it became very popular and continued to be popular through the end of the 19th century. I will return to us a little later. Now, the star of this project, of course, was Jacob Hooley. Hooley founded the multi-volume, the most voluminous series in Ladino literature, the famous Me'amloes, which means from the people, from a foreign people. He decided that it was necessary to educate people who do not know Hebrew by explaining the Bible to them. So he produced the first volume was Genesis. He explained everything that he thought that had to be explained, but he mainly used older rabbinic works. But he did it in a very readable form. Also, he included midrash, he included folk stories, culinary recipes, advice to women, and all sorts of things. And it was written in a very lively style. It's really very enjoyable. That was easily comprehensible for women, dim-witted women, and children. That was the goal. Because many people were illiterate, it also had to be read. It's written in such a way that it's clearly meant for oral communication. Then Hooley wrote 26 chapters of Exodus, and then he died. Now, it's common to hear that Me'amloes was the cornerstone of Sephardic Judaism, that every family in the 19th century had a volume. Well, that's not true. It was not the Me'amloes series. It was Hooley's work. After his death, the project was continued by 10 other rabbis. Not all of them were brilliant, rather boring. They experienced financial difficulties. They always complain that nobody buys their books, and therefore they have no money for publishing new books. So much for this being a favorite reading of Sephardic Jews. But Me'amloes indeed became a favorite. It was published 9 times through the end of the 19th century, and Exodus 7 times. So I'm sure many people had this volume because it was pleasant reading, but it also it had an influence on language, on way or method of teaching, and even on some stories. So let me now, there was another genre of didactic rabbinic literature, Musar, ethical treatise. In the 18th century, they were all translated from Hebrew, but in the 19th, many original works were written in Ladino, and some of them were quite popular. And they were also reprinted several times, which means they did reach a significant audience. Let me now quickly talk about the novels. For instance, in the introduction to Me'amloes, to Genesis, Hooley says that a calamity struck us. People, goyims, they can create stories, invent things that never happened. It's all vainglories, and they distract young people. Many other rabbis, even the introduction to the Bible translation, talks about these novels. And they talk about, in one of them talks about, says that it's those people who commission novels and pay for them are great fools. And interestingly, I believe that this literature, being entertaining, had an effect on the rabbis. For instance, Assad translated Sefer Ben Gurion, and he wrote in the preface, enough reading novels. Read this exciting book. And it actually was very readable and fun. And it was also reprinted several times in the 19th century, but of course it never replaced the novels and could have. We have just one excerpt from the one novel that miraculously survived. It was written by hand, and also because of its cultural status, those documents were not, novels were not preserved. So we have one, which is copied, written by a professional scribe on expensive paper. The rabbis continued their educational project, and they continued to hold monopoly on printing. No book could be printed without the rabbi's approval. But in the 19th century, it changed. In 1845, Raphael Uziel in Izmir published his first periodical, which was printed at the missionary press. And he did not get any approval of the rabbis. On the contrary, he licensed it with the government, as was the new law. The Ladino press was like, Sephardim would have had their periodical anyway, because everybody else did, and many communities had two periodicals, and Jews were actually the last to have periodical of their own in Izmir. But two events had a strong impact on their future, on their press and their culture. In 1839, so the Sultan proclaimed a Tanzimat decree, that is a reform edict. It launched fiscal, legal, and military reforms that aimed at turning the empire into a modern state. The reforms actually started in the 1820s, but at that time it was announced. Now, non-Muslims decided, because the language of the decree was very ambiguous, they decided that now they will be fully emancipated, but they continued to be dhimmis or zimmis in the Ottoman Empire another 17 years. Even though they were not, they were still dhimmis, they felt that very soon they would be emancipated, and they needed to be prepared for a different life. The second event that happened then was the blood libels that happened in February of 1840. They created a huge political crisis. The Ottomans dealt with the Rhodes blood libel as a legal case. They acquitted the Jews, they dismissed the governor, and gave some hope to the Jews that now something was going to change. But even more importantly, for the first time, Sephardim and Ashkenazim had a really long encounter, not as before, exchanging merchandise, but they talked, intellectuals to intellectuals. And this revealed to both sides that Sephardim were intellectually, socially isolated, and they were ignorant in many fields. So the idea of Raphael Uziel, who knew those people, probably he knew Montefiore, he started this periodical with the idea of educating his coreligionists and helping them become as good as European Jews. So that was the first time when it was proclaimed that the ideal is the European Jews. This newspaper used a lot of Hebrew, and it was, of course, meant for men who knew some Hebrew and who were interested in business and Jewish things. But it had a small circulation, less than 100 copies, and it lasted for only 9 months. There were 3 more periodicals that were also intended for men, educated, Lunar in Salonika, or Israelite in Istanbul, and even a journal, the Journal Israelite, which was published in Istanbul and was the organ of the council of the secular council of the community. But all these journals, all of them, aimed at the male audience, and of course their circulations were small, and they could not have any impact naturally. And until Sephardi literati turned to mass readerships, when they turned to mass readership, only then did they reach some commercial success, well, very modest, and then they contributed very significantly to the process of westernization. The first periodicals placed knowledge above all. It was all about learning. But the new generation, the newspapers that came out in the 1870s in Salonika, Izmir, and Istanbul, and they were published for many, many years, through 1930, they had a different agenda because they decided that it was necessary to provide moral education. But morality was not defined by religion alone. It was the new understanding of morality was spread by Franco-Judaism, and rather the ideology of Franco-Judaism that was spread in the Ottoman Empire by the Alliance Israélite Universelle Schools. So that's a philanthropic organization that was founded in Paris in 1860 and soon started opening schools in the Ottoman Empire for boys and girls. And they believed that a good person, moral person, is a conscientious citizen, responsible Jew, and a tolerant person. So that was presumably what the press decided to teach their readers. They published news they published international news, Ottoman news, reported on for Jews in other countries, although very often it was not factual, rather fabricated. And they discussed the news of their own community. The editors answered letters, they complained about readers, they squabbled with each other, they denounced their opponents. So it was very lively milieu. But the financial side was still unsuccessful because these people sometimes nobody sponsored them. Almost nobody. Almost all papers had to be paid for by the publisher, by subscriptions. So the same person might publish, print, write, translate, and distribute, only under different names. The only way and the circulations were low because low literacy, poverty, but also because Sephardim had a strange habit. They believed that one subscription would suffice for 3 households. And they read the newspapers out loud, and it reached, say, 10, 15 people this way, which annoyed the publishers. And the only way to raise the circulations was starting publishing serialized novels, which already, this is how they were published in France, in other European countries, and then in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkish, Armenian, Greek, and not in the Ottoman Empire, but also in Yiddish. So what were these novels? Until recently, when I started working in Ladino literature, all I read was that, those are bad translations of European literature, nothing to look at. But first of all, they're not bad. And second, they're not translations. I call them rewritings because it's very hard to find a sentence in Ladino that translates a sentence in the original. I know it's only one exception. People, those literati, journalists, they would take a European novel and sometimes abridge it to 16 pages. Even, let's say, Gulliver's Travels was abridged to 16 pages. They would change titles. They would not indicate the author's name. And they would Judaize those books because they wanted to educate their co-religionists, because that genre was market-oriented, but also reader-oriented. So they tried to introduce them to new European ways of living, but they did not actually make choices which novel to translate, because by that time, there had already been a canon of these works. So both Dumas, Victor Hugo, Jonathan Swift, Harriet Beecher Stowe, by the way, and Fenelon, and then who else? I mean, many writers that were translated. Le Mystère de Paris. So it was a set. It was a canon. And one of the journalists, Alexander Benguiat, who wrote many works, he put together a list of novels that had to be translated. And actually, most of them had been translated by that time, or rather rewritten. So I call their authors rewriters. There was a lot of original work in that. Whether this novel became better is a different story, but there was a lot of work, and they added things. For instance, in Gulliver's Travels, Benguiat adds an episode where Gulliver is praying, promising God that he will be a good son after that, and so God saves him. So they really did things with this text. Of course, not everyone. They had probably large circulations because when you look in the archive and all periodicals, you very often see cut out pages. And that is because they really wanted to own them. They put them together, glued them, and they were chapbooks. So that was it was lucrative for those who published them. And it was very interesting for Sephardim because it dealt with new things. It dealt with secular knowledge that was different from what they found in the periodicals. So, for instance, whoever talked about love in Ladino, and now you get all these love novels. And by the way, the titles of many novels were female names. So that was also interesting and unusual. Ladino, so in a way, the serialized novel, had even a more significant influence, westernizing influence on the population because everybody read that. Those people who didn't care for politics, they read those novels. Even people who were fluent in French would read them because very often it was the only source, the newspapers were the only source of local news. After all, it was fun reading. Although some Sephardim learned French in their young schools, it wasn't good enough to read novels in the original, and they were unaffordable anyway and unavailable. The third genre of Ladino literature that emerged in that period is drama. But I use drama to refer to a collection of plays produced in Ladino for the needs of the Sephardic theater. Sephardic theater was never institutionalized. It was a charitable didactic practice. So people would go to a school or to a club, they would put on a play. It could be Racine, it could be a stupid story, it could be propagandistic later, Zionist propaganda, or something explaining Jewish holidays. It's just everything. There was no single. See, the novels actually, they had more in common with each other than with the originals. It was a genre, but here they were all different. The proportion of rewritings was very small, actually, and these plays were published very often as separate books and used for staging. The first period of Sephardic theater, between 1873, the first mention, to 1908, the Young Turk Revolution, was dominated, not solely, but mainly by the Alliance, by Franco-Judaism. The second period, which started in 1908, when censorship was temporarily abolished, and Zionist press, there was a resurgence of Zionist and satirical press. And through the end of I guess it continued even in Turkey and in Israel and in America, which actually novels were also brought there. So Sephardic theater, it's a cultural practice. It was very important, but it does not give us a lot of, we'll talk about lasting value, but in my view, it's the least interesting genre because it's not a genre, it's just a collection. People would get together on a Saturday, bring money for something, buy tickets, sit there, And these plays, interestingly, they were discussed in the press, but how? They were described as instructive, helpful, uh, healthy, moral, and amusing. So it's only their functions that actually matters to those people, to those who wrote about, to the literati. Because Sephardim continued reading in out loud, that of course stifled the the emergence of individual literary genres that need to be read by individuals, such as lyric poetry and memoirs. There were a few things, but not a genre really. So what happens by the end of the 19th century, Hebrew that had not been challenged. I forgot to mention that there were really a lot of Musars, and these Musars tried to deal with the new reality. So they explained often pseudo scientific explanations of different natural phenomena, but also they propagated vaccination, which was a state-sponsored project. And people read them. But by the end of the 19th century, the use of Hebrew was limited only to the synagogue and education. Now we might suspect and expect that at this time, the low language would have replaced the high language in its function, in the functions that it left. It no longer fulfilled. But that was not so, because Ladino had a very strong competitor, French. French was spoken, as I told you, it was taught, but in the 1890s, Sephardi intellectuals published several periodicals in French for each other. They wrote memoirs, they wrote histories in French. So Ladino never had a chance. And then after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the appearance of nation states, of course, Ladino as a minority language had very low prestige. Young people wouldn't speak it, wouldn't read. And at that point, of course, Ladino literature was indeed in decline. And then the Holocaust and mass migrations after the war, World War II, that actually put an end to this literature and to many speakers and readers. It's true that after World War I, some individual authors published works in Ladino, what they consider Ladino, but it's works of individuals, not a production of the Sephardic community. Well, that's it. I have new ideas, but I just started working on them just the other day, so I can't tell you anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Olga. I want to invite our listeners, who include a range of Sephardic history and Ladino scholars I can see, to post questions. Please do so in the chat, and I'll try and relay them as best I can. And I'll take I'll have the pleasure and honor of asking the first question. And I want to kind of pull us all the way back, maybe to the two edges of the talk. On the one hand, starting where you ended, but let me begin all the way back with Almas Nino. The thing that binds your three periods together in your account is the educative project that these folks share. And what I find hard to sort of understand about the first episode is, and maybe this is really just a problem of sources, but to what degree was he really on his own in this undertaking? Are there other figures we can point to that we might think of as sort of early post-expulsion Eastern Mediterranean Sephardic intellectuals engage in a similar project? And that because it might also be a question of scale. That is, how many people was he trying to speak to? And so it'd be nice to sort of know a little more about your sense about what the larger sociology of a figure like Almas Nino was. That's one question.
Thank you. That's actually an interesting question. First of all, the first immigration to the Ottoman Empire, I should have said that there were no more than 60,000 Jews, and we can tell this by the tax registers Ottoman tax registers. Then late in the century, there were more, like 80,000. So the immigration from Europe was not actually large. So who published books in Ladino? Almosnino did not. That was done by other people, and we know their names, although one of them is Joseph Foreman. It doesn't tell us anything about that. As for Almosnino, I thought about it as well. I think that he was, and in one case, that's for sure, he was compelled to do it by his patrons, like Nasi, who was the closest to Sultan, the Sultan, and there were Jewish doctors, and they wanted smart, wealthy Jews to collaborate with the state. And so I think in two cases, it was him. So there's a book, a treatise on dreams. And Agustin says that Nasi asked him to do it. Then the Chronicle of Ottoman Kings, it starts with some rather vague sentences where he says that, oh, my friends asked me to write about it because I was in Istanbul at that time. I saw the Suleiman's funeral and so forth. So in these two cases, we know for sure. In the book that The Regimen of Living, he says that his nephew asked him. And in every treatise, he says, someone asked me to explain how to use the astrolabe. But I think the whole project, the ideology, came from the elite. And then there were two books. There's a Fuente Clara, a clear source. That's a Jewish apologetics, also for intellectuals. We don't know who wrote it. And then there was a treatise on the scarlet fever published in 1601, also written by ex-converso doctor. But it was printed by the same press as the previous book I mentioned. So we may assume that that press, someone who dealt with this press, wanted to encourage such publications. If I haven't fully answered your question, I don't think I can tell you anymore.
No, very wonderful. Another question. What can you tell us more about? I was really struck by the fact that, that you relayed to us, that some of these, the remnant of this 18th century novel we have, which points in your telling to a much larger phenomenon. And I'd like to hear sort of how you know it's a larger phenomenon. Are there any other sources beyond the fact that the rabbis sort of complain about it? Because that's something arguably that early modern rabbis often do, no matter what's going on around them. But
that's in your case, not in ours.
But tell us more about the I think in the on the Yiddish side of things, early modern Ashkenaz, the assumption, which might be an incorrect assumption, and maybe I'm just out of date, is that that interest in novels was a sort of popular pastime, and it was made easy by the creation of print, and so you could produce sort of chapbook sorts of things. But in your case, you're telling us that whoever commissioned this novel was a sort of person who had the money to be able to commission something. So it's not quite, it's in some ways, maybe my question is, you have this diglossic model, but how the languages were supposed to fit structures, broadly speaking, of where the social elite was located. But this suggests that some part of the social elite was what was driving the production and consumption of, as it were, religiously illicit Ladino novels in the 18th century, right? So even if Hooley and his friends, as a rhetorical strategy, said, we must address the ignorance of the masses, we actually have a sense that it's not the masses at all who are paying for the commissioning the production of these novels. So tell us more, if you could, about the what you think the sort of 18th century sociology of the novels was.
They're thinking about the so-called ignorant masses, but apparently those same masses read novels. Now, you didn't ask me where they got that from. And this also has to do with immigration. In the 18th century, many Livornese Jews immigrated to the Ottoman Empire. They lived in port cities and called them Francos. And I have some very tangential evidence. And of course, they read books. We know that they had their portraits painted, and they read literature, fiction. while they were in Europe or in Italy, in Livorno especially. So I suspect that there was the source. I can't think of anything else. Now, these novels, this was indeed a fragment of a chivalric novel. I think that maybe those people or other merchants brought them and sold them to those who wanted to pay to read them, because people want something entertaining. As one author wrote, and he actually, I didn't speak about it very like this, because he was in Livorno, he says an interesting thing. He says, it's enough publishing theological books. We don't want to read about religion or everything, always the same thing. And we don't want, and we want intelligent books. And I think that's a jab at the novels. And he said, let us write useful books. It's really clear that there was a need in other books. It was boring to read religious literature all the time.
Thank you. We have a question from Elias Fascia, which pushes us much more toward the 20th century, of course, who asks, are there any collections of Ladino texts written during the Holocaust, inside or outside the camps? And if so, how can they be obtained or accessed?
Well, of course, I did mention that the Ladino literature, the corpus is fewer than 4,000 texts because they either burned, well, most of them burned. And of course, in the whole, I've never heard of Ladino literature, any literature during the Holocaust. But there is literature, there is the poem, there's prose accounts in Ladino, but they were written by survivors. And if you want to know more about those people who did write, though I don't think during the Holocaust, you should go to Devin Nair, and he has University of Washington. They have a big collection, and there are people who know this thing. I haven't worked on that at all.
Devin Nair, that's Naar, Mr. Fascia. Olivia Young asks, my understanding from the historiography is that Haketia, sometimes called the Western variant of Ladino, has no literature and was largely used as just a spoken language. I'm not entirely sure if this was really true, but I'm curious to know if you might have seen any evidence of a circulation of Ladino literature of any type to Sephardim in North Africa, because the language would have had a degree of mutual intelligibility.
Well, thank you. Yes, Haketia was much closer to Spanish than Ladino because they lived in Morocco and there was constant trade with Spain. So of course their language slowly assimilated. And no, there was no literature. But again, they had proverbs and they had songs, and those things have been described. And I am not aware of literary exchanges with Sephardim, Ottoman Sephardim. I don't think they were in close contacts at all.
Here's a question that will bring us, Olga, you'll appreciate maybe this, bring us all the way back to some of our first conversations together. And it's a question with a little bit of an edge, but hopefully
Good. I like
productive. I mean, one of the things that that the sort of modern mind rebels against when you say that there was no, let's call it a literary impulse or an aesthetic impulse in this literature, is the sense that in so many other cases, contact, when it's a very romantic idea, but it's not entirely wrong, contact with one's own folklore or a kind of reconnection, literal and figurative, to the cradle and the lullaby was generative of so much sort of poetic sensibility and aesthetic sensibility in other settings. And I'm curious, I mean, is there a moment of folklorism and interest in, let's say, Ladino song, particularly the song Wandered Home, in these same circles? And does it not have any kind of aesthetic issue for, these would-be educators who are also, people and presumably have some kind of sentimental attachment or are capable of sentimental attachment to their own tradition? So I know we talked about Devin Nair, there's been work on histories and history writing of communities in the same period, sometimes French, sometimes Ladino, sometimes Hebrew. But are there folkloristic excursions and a kind of in that moment of sort of Herderian rediscovery of one's own language, or that's really just not something you see?
Yes, there was, first of all, there was great interest in folklore in ballads at the turn of the 20th century in Salonika. So chapbooks were published. Again, new collections were published. And I do not see any impact of this, in my view, beautiful songs on their literary production. They were proud of their folklore. Also, they're important. There were people at the end of the 19th century, some Sephardic scholars decided that it's time to collect documents for originals from their own communities and write histories of their communities. So they started collecting these documents. And out of this, we have two important scholars. So Avraham Danon, who wrote a lot about, for instance, if you're talking about folklore, he wrote about Purim couplets, he wrote about other ballads, but it was not, of course, for aesthetic reasons. He analyzes them as a scholar does. You just read it. I enjoy it. And the second one was a really important scholar, Abraham Galante, who he started collecting text already in the late 19th century, I think, in Rhodes. And then he has 9 volumes of history, Sephardic history of Ottoman Jews, and somewhere from time to time he does publish a song. That's true. But it's interesting that I do not see in the press any discussion of it.
And so someone else is asking about songs, so maybe I'll just annex a further question after we turn to her question. So Marta Nicholas asks, do you find any evidence that the lyrics of Ladino songs, several of which are still sung, she adds, were printed for distribution? So direct printing and distribution of songs for popular consumption.
Yes, they were printed, but especially, for instance, Sadi Halevi, who's quite well known, he is the founder of La Época, Le Journal de Salonique. He was also a printer and a poet. So it was not lyric poetry. So he preserved Purim songs and other holiday festive songs, and he published them several times. And many songs reached us printed, but we don't know how many copies they made because, of course, we're lucky when we have one. So we can't tell how many there were. But I think that people knew them. Like having worked on this, I already know the lyrics. So I think they would have known better.
So maybe the follow-up question to that would be, again, to press a little bit on because in some sense, one of the, I think implicit in your theorization of modern Ladino literature, and let's say it's the ways in which it did develop and the ways in which it seems not to have developed, is an argument that there's never a kind of countervailing impulse to the purely educational westernizing impulse. That is to say, everybody who engages in it because they think I need to reach the masses who don't have French and provide sort of a moralizing, a text that will moralize and is coated in some kind of sugar so it goes down more easily, right? A little bit of sugar and the medicine goes down.
No, it's not true. I think that, first of all, this literati wanted to make money. That is why they had published serialized novels that really helped them. Also, they wanted something very engaging. Otherwise, people would not buy their periodicals. And so it was market-oriented genre. But at the same time, they used the opportunity to educate people. Like I gave you an example from Gulliver's Travels. But very often, people learned from this novel, which does not mean that the actual rewriter meant to teach them something. So the main motivation was money. I'm sorry to say that.
So, okay, education and money, neither of which, right, is the kind of impulse that leads to a sort of high cultural project in any way. And I guess maybe my question really is, so we do have interest in songs, we have an interest in folklore. And you have a sort of formalist imagination, which is one of the things I really appreciate about the work. Can you tell us, are there no beginnings of something that look like a more rounded notion of authorship? Are there no authors that you can see at a formal level beginning to think about the kind of expressive resources of the language differently than people did a generation ago, right? Some kind of, there's, the recursive loop that allows for a literature to to develop in relation to itself. You see, there's nothing
I
that we can
understand.
see
Yeah,
of
of
it.
course. I thought about it many times. So Ladino literature, speaking of authorship, the rabbis usually signed their works and they had something like copyright, not Sephardic literati who dealt with secular literature. My explanation, so they would either sign with their names those serialized novels, or they would mention the name of the author of the original, or they would describe the authorship to the editor of the newspaper which first published it, or they would not indicate anything at all. And so it was this literature was all anonymous. I think this is because Ladino literature was still at the early modern period, and authorship and individuation were not. There was no authorial voice. That's what you mean. There was the voice of the Sephardic community. And at the very end, right, the beginning of the 20th century, we have a few things that might have turned into something. So there are three memoirs, and one of them, written by Reina Cohen, interesting because it includes her poetry. And it's in Hebrew and Ladino. It's her autobiography, it's her confession. It hasn't been published yet. I hope it will be published soon. That seems to be something you're talking about. The other memoirs are more stories of the presses that published them, where their works, or Salonika, or how people dressed in Salonika in those days, and so forth. Now, I was very interested in lyric poetry, and I looked at several collections. And at first glance, you think, oh, sounds like a European poem, but they all consist of cliches, all of them. And the poems that were published in the Ladino press, they were either funny or they were written to glorify the Sultan or someone else. So no lyric poetry at all.
And for those who are still tuned in, I do invite more questions. I can ask questions all day. So let me follow up on. I'll note, by the way, we have a little bit of Reina Cohen in our in an anthology that I collected. Uh, and her impulse is a kind of religious impulse, right? There's a sort of mystical confessional impulse in that text.
Yeah.
And maybe that's another question. There's a way in which, partially because of your work in that first book, partially because of Aaron's work, Sarah's work, we have a strong sense of the kind of overriding, let's call it westernizing and educational impulse as the organizing, and to which you'll add the market, right? Organizing impulse for a lot of this literary production in the 19th century. Her case is really quite peculiar, as you said, and I mean, it'd be nice to know if it was truly unique or not. But it's
She
partially
wrote the
if she's
Musar, by the way.
yeah, I mean, that's just so what's there's a religious impulse in her writing,
Yes.
which is very different from, and in some ways already counterposed to the westernizing impulse. And so maybe can you talk about the continuities or maybe resurgence of counter-modern and let's call them maybe religiously driven sensibilities in Ladino literature, or is she really unique in this
Well, I think she's unique in every way, and that's why Julia suggested that you include her. We know that authors, of course, rabbis who wrote Ladino Musars in the 19th century, they were very critical of secular literature. And they, of course, that people did not observe the rules and so forth. Of course, they were critical. There's no question about it. Whether people wanted, I'm sure there were individuals who really focused on religion the way Rainy Cohen did. But I don't think we know about that. I've never seen anything like that. And by the way, well, no, I want to betray what I'm working on, but I won't. No, it's not time yet. But I think that I don't see any evidence of this. Let's put it this way.
Thank you. Jake Daniels asks, maybe this is in some ways some of the same kind of concerns. Would you say that Ladino literature and Ottoman Sephardi culture were averse to romanticism in the 19th century?
Well, if you mean Jake consciously averse, of course not, because they didn't know about it. And so I don't know what else, because unconsciously they needed to know about romanticism to oppose it, right? I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't even understand it. If they don't know romanticism, why would they oppose it?
Well, maybe if I'll let Jake follow up, but for instance, do you have Ladino translations slash transductions of Ivanhoe? Do you have anything from the kind of European romantic tradition that makes its way into the sort of canon of rewritten novels?
But the way they rewrote them, they were no longer romantic. They took out everything except for action. It was action, action, action. Or descriptions, dialogues they would take out. So you would have no knowledge of whether it was romantic or not. That wouldn't sell.
Well, a follow-up question then. Um, you know, you're treating your authors in terms of the functions they ascribe to themselves, right? They wanted to produce something that would sell, and that was a kind of handmaiden to trying to circulate the newspapers and so forth. But presumably they themselves, as I mean, so if they're able to sort of to take a text that was in some sense romantic, that had romantic tropes or whatever other sorts of tropes, and figure out how to edit them out, right? They sluice them out, and all that comes through is the action.
Yes, yes.
But presumably they themselves are engaging with these texts on the front end in a different way. And so maybe that's a question that would point us toward I mean, do we find them doing things in other languages that they won't do in Ladino in ways that let us understand them better through?
Actually, I thought about this morning. So you see, first of all, not they translated usually written French text, and there were novels written in English, let's say later in Hebrew, that were translated first to French, and then from French to Ladino. So they, in many cases, they didn't see the original. Also, I saw with all the travels that Vignette used an adapted edition, not the original. And I don't know what books they dealt with. Maybe those were, they were writing that were, no, that wouldn't be French. No, that wouldn't work. So what they thought about these novels would be very interesting to know, but there's no way of knowing. They never talk about them.
Even the figures that we have, I mean, we have a fair amount of sort of semi-autobiographical writing by some of the editors, right?
Yeah,
And
three memoirs, as far as I know. Maybe there will be more. I'm sure people will find more.
yeah, all right. And so from those, you can't develop a kind of larger, sort of thicker cultural portrait of their own sense of what culture was, for instance. I mean, there's a phenomenon in the East European case, right? Of people who produce popular, sometimes ideologically driven stuff in Yiddish, and at home, of course, they live their lives in Russian or Polish, and that breaks at a certain juncture, and you get people doing that, living lives, in Yiddish at home too. But clearly, when we study those folks, I mean, the two figures who were the head of the Bund in the interwar period were both Polish speakers at home. And when we study them, or one's a Russian speaker, one's a Polish speaker, you can see that they do things in those so-called high languages that they don't really bother doing in Yiddish. But if you were trying to create a portrait of them, you'd be able to. You'd have to work, through their Polish and Russian as well as Yiddish writings. And so is there nothing like that one could do for for Saadia Levi or Galante? You couldn't get a sense of what
Galante
kind
did not
of
write memoirs. We have memoirs from Sadi Halevi, Carmona, Ilya Carmona, and Alexander Ben-Ghiat. They have Sadi Halevi is a portrait of Salonika, that's all. And how he was banished by the rabbis. That's all it is about. It's very interesting, but it has nothing to do with high culture. It does describe folk customs for sure, but it has nothing to do with what you're asking. Alexander Ben-Ghiat, I think, the most, so to speak, lyrical. He's interested in feelings, I believe. And Elia Carmona, that's a satire. It's a joke. So they did not, some people wrote, for instance, Sam Levy, he published a newspaper, as you know, Ladino and French, but his memoirs were written in French.
Yeah.
And there we learn something about him for sure, yes.
Great. Jake follows up. Even if writers did not explicitly engage with romanticism, did any romantic currents enter the literature? For example, a new interest in folkways, small towns, natural landscapes, etc. That's a nice, yeah, landscape, right.
Jake and I discussed landscapes. They cut all landscapes. They were not interested in this. Small towns, I've never seen. Well, you know how Sam Levitt travels and he talks about the Jewish communities. Whether it's a big town or a small one, I don't think it makes any difference. No, I don't see any of these things that you mentioned.
With the exception of folkways, right? Where you tell us there
But
was.
that is Saudi Halevi.
Uh-huh.
You see, everybody was interested in Europe. They wanted to be Europeans. And Saudi really treasured their heritage,
Treasure. I'm sorry. Say that again, Olga.
treasured Sephardic heritage, customs, what people ate, how they celebrated weddings. He describes it in great detail. He cares about it.
Yeah, and maybe that's the where Jake and I mean, that seems to be a point of let's call it a positive ideology toward one's own community that's very different from the, or at least a different step in relation to the kind of educative drive that you've flagged, right? So,
Actually, he starts by saying that this is meant for young people, for them to learn. And he's positive about the customs, although he makes fun of some of them. But it's also very negative because he constantly condemns the rabbis that they're fanatical, they're ignorant, they insulted him. So it's also very negative.
fantastic. Uh, I think
It's
I invite
retaliation, really, in print. Yeah.
you've given us a very compelling and intimate portrait of the community. And retaliation, of course, is certainly part of communal life. Uh, um, so uh, I'll invite any further questions. Um, and if not, I will think it remains to thank our speaker for an incredible sprint through 4 centuries of writing and incredibly illuminating talk.